I'm thinking a bit more about atheism today. I'm not quite sure why, but here I am thinking about that again. And there's a couple of kind of niggling problems I have with my own atheism, and particularly how atheism generally is kind of represented, or some of the language around it, and the kind of statements that are made in relation to it. And the first thing is to do with what it means to not believe something. If you're an atheist, it means you don't believe in the concept of God. So I have read some arguments that say that in a sense atheists have got nothing to prove, which is correct, but that atheism is simply the absence of belief, and it has no significance as a kind of mindset or as a way of thinking, because it's a negative. There's nothing there to believe in, so it makes no sense to talk about atheism as a particular thing. It's the absence of a thing. I don't entirely buy that, I think. The reason why I don't buy it, I think, is because absences of let's call it belief for now, absence of the active subscription to an idea, whether that be God or anything else, is quite an active thing, actually, I think. I'm kind of imagining it as kind of the negative space that you get in some sculptures. Henry Moore, sculpture from the early part of the 20th century, made these great shapes. One of the things he was really concerned about wasn't just the space where the bronze was then eventually cast out into. He was also interested in the negative space, the indentations and the kind of void spaces. And you also find that, I think, in sculpture later. So something like Carl Andre sculptures in his equivalent series, the Equivalent 8, for example, which was a bit notorious in Britain, at least. It was made of house bricks, two piles of house bricks on the ground. And one of the things that he talks about in terms of those particular works is, if you're focusing just on the material substance that you're looking at, you're kind of missing the point, because the sculpture isn't just the object. The sculpture is the negative space around the object. It's the space that isn't the thing. It's the emptiness, the shaping of the emptiness that the sculpture performs. And you get it very clearly in Rachel Whiteread's sculptures, where she does these castings of the negative spaces that we find in domestic situations. So she did a whole series of sculptural works where she would cast the space underneath a chair or underneath a bed, something like that. So you get a positive object of what would normally be in a negative space, and so that negative space comes to your attention. And she famously did House, which was a terraced house in East London that she cast the entire inside of. So it was just the negative space inside a house. And I think one of the things, and in a sense, I think that's how I'm kind of imagining negative belief or negative subscription. When you positively don't subscribe to an idea, and it doesn't actually have to be belief, I'm saying about it in terms of belief, but I think you can subscribe to all kinds of ideas in ways that don't actually involve belief, in ways which are just about observance of certain actions and rituals, or which are just about a kind of emotional attachment to the idea, or just a kind of setting up a communitas with fellow subscribers, that kind of relationship. And where those things represent kind of positive space, the positive imaginary space of that idea, knowing about those beliefs and then rejecting them, or knowing about that subscribed to object, subscribed to entity, and then rejecting it, in a sense I do think creates a kind of negative space, which isn't to say it's a bad thing. Sculptures need negative space, and absolutely I think it's very important that we consciously desubscribe from certain ideas, and God may absolutely be one of those. In fact, I think God's a particularly interesting one, because that kind of leads me into the second point. One of the other comments that is often made in terms of atheism, and Dawkins makes this point, but other people make it too, is that, why do we talk about atheism as if it's a thing when we don't talk about atheists or aleprechaunistas people who don't believe in fairies, don't believe in leprechauns. Well, you could, but it's just not very interesting. It isn't a very interesting negative space. I mean, that would be my argument. The reason why we do say atheist, and why I self-describe myself as an atheist, is because for me it's a really interesting negative space to have in this kind of organised sculptural set of ideas and experiences I give myself. Whereas not believing in leprechauns is pretty insignificant little dimple on the surface of my sculptural life. So I do think not believing in something is very important. I also think, and I'm probably stepping outside of my own thought processes here, but because of that kind of negative space, and indeed the positive space of ideas, in a sense it doesn't really matter to some extent about whether the thing you're subscribing to in terms of the construction of this conceptual sculpture, it doesn't really matter whether that thing is real or not. You know, choosing to subscribe to and by subscribe, as I say, I mean something more and more complex than just belief. It could be all kinds of things. It could be use or something. Choosing to subscribe to an idea, even if it's fictional, or even if it's false, or even if it's I don't know, something else, as long as it's not actively destructive, it can be quite interesting. And similarly, choosing not to subscribe to an idea is interesting. And I choose not to subscribe to the God idea, but I think a lot about the idea of God. I spend a lot of time kind of gnawing away at that idea and scooping out more of that particular conceptual space and articulating and shaping it for myself really carefully. And I haven't got very far with it yet. I've still got a long way to go with that particular piece of carving. But in a sense, it doesn't matter whether God exists or not. Clearly, it doesn't. But as a sculptural element in the kind of artwork of life I'm trying to make here, that is a very interesting void. I like the existence of that void, and I think the sculpture of my life would be diminished if that void wasn't there, if I hadn't consciously thought very carefully about God and consciously decided not to subscribe to the idea. I suppose it's a kind of a side issue here, but just as I've been talking about life as a kind of sculpture, I'm reminded of one of my favourite essays actually, which is a William James essay called something like The World as Sculpture. And he's talking about the fact that as we move through our lives we make certain choices. He's mostly talking about perception, but conception is also an integral part of that. And how each one of us is kind of constructing this sculptural object of our lives from the material which is common to us all, but we all have individual artifacts, the individual lives that we end up with at the end of it. And I like to think of them as being a bit like Henry Moore's, or a bit like Carl Andre's, or a bit like Rachel Whiteley's.